Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Welcome. This is Jamie from LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. And Jerry and I have set a goal this year to make sure that we have some more global perspectives on our podcast. I think we did a really great job when we first started, and then we slacked a little bit. So we set a goal for ourselves. We had a couple this year, and we're going to have several more in the next couple of months. And we're going to kick it off with one today. So I'm looking forward to this one today, Jerry.
I am too. So our guest today is Brantley Turner, and she has been working in China for the last 25 years. Is that correct, Brantley? 25 years? Well,
Absolutely.
The reason I have to ask is because you don't look old enough to have worked there for 25 years. But I am so intrigued with the work that she's doing and has done, opening a school there, working as a principal alongside with a Chinese colleague, and just really being on that path to connecting kids globally. So Brantley, welcome to the LinkedUp podcast. We are so glad to have you here. Can you tell us just a little bit about what you've been doing in China and kind of bring us up to the present day?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for having me. It's great to be here. So the short version is I deserve no credit for starting to go to China. It was absolutely, I grew up in New York. My parents are from the South. They had been on a migration journey, from the South to the North, and they kept going. And when I was 17, they moved to Hong Kong. For work. I was going to college, so I didn't move with them, but that's what opened the opportunity. I hate to say this. I took AP World History. I don't know if I knew Beijing was the capital of China when I was 17, particularly clearly. So I certainly was not primed for engaging with Asia, didn't have any language experience, and got to go on a business trip with my mother to Beijing before I started college and thought, wow, this is really interesting. Maybe I should take some classes in school. And I got really into it. And I took Mandarin and I learned a lot of Asian history from a lot of different perspectives, not just China, a lot of North Asian history, Vietnam, South Asia history as well. And so then decided when I graduated from undergrad that I would go and test myself out. So I moved directly to mainland China. I went to graduate school there. So I studied foreign policy in Mandarin in the Johns Hopkins program in China, and decided, you know what, I don't want to go into the State Department or necessarily go on a path that a lot of my classmates might choose. Why don't I stay in China and see what it feels like to work here? So I started working, and I started out in advertising, market research, not in education. But the long version of how I got to education was that I always wanted to be in education. I was a teaching assistant in college. I worked at daycare and summer camps and all sorts of things. I was a tutor. I taught English in China poorly, very poorly. But the opportunities were not available to do teaching other than teaching English or working at a school for foreign nationals in China when I first got there. And so did all those other things, but I circled back to education in 2005. I ran an experiential education business that I started for many years, bringing students from all over the world to China for different learning experiences. And from that, the opportunity grew to work with the Dwight schools out of New York, a 151-year-old school as of this year. And we had a program in Beijing that I was working on for 6 years. And through that process, started the school in Shanghai. What's special about the school in Shanghai is it is the only Sino-US cooperative run high school approved by the Ministry of Education. So it's really a special designation in a highly regulated landscape. China's education system is a highly regulated landscape. So we really thread the needle on what was possible from a policy perspective. Started this school 10 years ago. I was the founding American principal. I'm still on the board. I am on my way out of that experience. I've handed over my job to a wonderful successor. And I'm in New York right now, but I am moving to Vietnam in a couple months. So really just continuing to look at Asia from different perspectives, and also the US from different perspectives.
So now that you've started a school in China, or part of that, we want to hear a lot more about that. What are you going to be doing in Vietnam?
So same same story, slightly different picture. So still Dwight schools, and we have 6 schools, including the China school in our network. We're really a family of schools, and Dwight is a family-run school. It's been under the control and leadership of the same family for the last 80 years. And we are starting a pre-K through grade 12 school in Hanoi. So we're in the process of working through the establishment. We are under construction. The cranes are rolling. And I have the opportunity to really spearhead that project from the pedagogical side. I'm, of course, working with the team, and I'm not the only one involved, but it's a real gift. I speak, read, and write Mandarin Chinese. I cannot speak a word or read or write a word of Vietnamese. So I'm trying to take that growth mindset that we push in our classrooms and apply it to myself and try something new.
In your experience, what have been the rewards and the challenges in working side by side in a foreign country?
So I gave a talk the other night to a group of folks, of which not one was an educator. And I thought, oh goodness, they're not going to want to hear about what I have to say, because people, oh, that's great. You run a school, a principal. I mean, that's the first thing people write off, right? So I said, listen, guys, just for your interest, since most of you are in finance, I ran a successful joint venture in China. There are many joint ventures that have not been successful in China or will continue to not be successful in China. So let's talk about the building blocks of a successful JV, period, and also one that's a Sino-US JV. So number one, Dwight was the deputy partner in that joint venture. So due to the way the regulations work, the Chinese partner has to be in the driving seat. So that's also partner management. And I think number one, I'm just communication. So what people get wrong, and you see a lot of school projects fail, you see a lot of joint venture projects fail. And when you dig in, you learn that the key principles, the key parties stop talking to each other. The Chinese principal who I founded the school with is still at the helm of the school, and she does not speak English and hasn't spent a lot of time outside of China. She's a PhD from a very wonderful Chinese university. But again, I think what I brought was kind of that intercultural competence, the language competence, a willingness to listen, a willingness to hear a lot of stuff that made me go, and then just keep moving. But I think staying open to hearing what others have to say, and always, starting from the fact that we're both just two human beings, and she had pressures and I have pressures, and we need to find common ground. And there is often common ground to find, right? People just get sort of tangled up in the differences. And so I was asked all the time in Chinese media, what is different? What is hard? And I would always say, okay, can we start with what is similar? What is easy? And because that helped me come at things that understood, do we fundamentally know what each other needs, wants, feels? And then can we get to what makes sense? And I used to say, and anybody who's worked with me has heard this so many times, it's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And if you need to be right all the time, you will often fail to get it right because you will not be open and receptive to other ways of thinking. And that was the gift of that experience.
Yeah, I think that whole experience you've had, the leadership component, and really seeing the importance and the great value in that true collaboration and being able to be open-minded and being able to listen to each other in order to be the best for the students ultimately, right? So, and I always valued that as well, as having students be able to have those skills and build those skills. So how have you seen that transfer into the classroom? What types of innovations are you seeing? How are students developing as global thinkers in that scenario in your world?
So I, just to kind of introduce to listeners, come from the tradition of teaching in the International Baccalaureate. So IB curriculum, as it's known, which is less well known in the US, but is a global standard. The IB really puts international mindedness at the core of that curriculum. And so in our school in China, we run the IB, and therefore must be focusing on those conversations of different perspectives, of there's a core class in the IB called Theory of Knowledge. And the whole class is in the diploma program. So the last 2 years of the curriculum, how do we know what we know? And how do we look at that from an ethics lens, from a religious lens, from an artistic lens, from a scientific lens, from a mathematical lens? And this is really valuable. Now, by the way, a lot of kids think the class is boring. They're like, oh, why are we doing this?
My daughter was an IB student.
And it's hard, right? It has to be taught well. But so I think that in the context that I'm in, often the IB has been a really central part of saying, no, guys, we need to have this conversation. We need to have this dialogue. But at the same time, I think you're completely right that this is so critical for students today more than ever. And just a quick rationale, and you've done shows on this, the metaverse and AI and all the information that students are exposed to. I had the exciting opportunity this past semester, this fall, to teach some of the IBDP global politics class to our grade 11 students at Dwight, New York. Love it. When I retire, that's what I'm going to do. It's my favorite thing. And every day, because I was teaching power, the concept of power over many, many lessons from many different viewpoints in global politics. And just constantly challenging those students. They like to make statements. Well, this country feels this way because da, 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 da. And it's like, no, okay. Walk this back. Like, help me argue the counterpoint. I'm not telling you to believe the counterpoint, but help me present it. Help me argue it. Help me understand it. If I'm going to disagree with you, what am I going to say to you? And just these aha moments for kids, right? As they start to realize, well, gosh, I've never thought about that from the other point of view. I've never walked in somebody else's shoes. I've never thought about these conflicts from a different side. And so just back to the sort of AI and the challenges brought on by the speed with which our technology is changing. I believe the absolutely fundamental critical skill for the future is the ability to spot bias, to understand when you are being sold something, when you are being duped. Talking about, deep fakes, these images that are not real, but are created and are pushed at our kids. More than ever, they need to be able to read and to decode textual and visual information. They're going to be overwhelmed by it for their lives. And so I think that's the responsibility we have, right? When we talk about global citizens, some people would brand me, well, she's a globalist. All she wants is an interconnected, interdependent world. Well, it's not about what I want. It's about what I see and what I think is reality, which is we are interdependent and we are interconnected. So we better learn how to process information in that kind of space, or we are seriously harming our kids.
I think you're totally right about spotting the bias. And I think for the first time, maybe not the first time, but we see it more, are the visual biases that can be created now. A picture can be created and you don't know if it's right or wrong. And so how do you get kids to start to spot that?
So, it's so fascinating. Life is like, everybody has such an interesting, unique journey, and I feel like I'm at this really unique point because I'm sort of thinking about China as like my first mountain. I had to get in there. I didn't know anything. I was freaked out. Sometimes I wouldn't leave my apartment on the weekends, just being overwhelmed, like, it's so different outside. And that was kind of the first mountain. And I feel like I'm starting to climb on the second mountain. But in undergrad, in college, I double majored in East Asian studies and art semiotics, which is a real niche term for basically the idea. For language, we have linguistics. For visual codes, right, we have semiotics, which is a way of seeing what we're seeing. My father was like, what is that? And why are you studying it? And what in the world? This sounds like you're just going to have fun. And, for my parents who come from a very different background than I had as a student, were like, what is that? That doesn't sound very practical.
Right. What
and the way
are you gonna get with that?
Exactly. Yeah. And the way it's come back, and they appreciate art, but it's not art. It was visual media and theory and all these ideas. And the arc that's come back for me now is, wow, we were looking at impressionist paintings and saying, what's really going on in this picture? And what is this artist trying to tell us? And what are we not seeing about what it's communicating? And that is so valuable now when we see the way in which images are framed, in which a story is told from two different perspectives. I took a class in college called, it was basically World War II from the Japanese perspective. And again, not about belief or what you believe or what side you were on. But the number of times in that class that we were shown something that was a US piece, like a US article, I was like, oh, Japan must have written that because of the way it was written. Like, oh gosh, I mean, and I think just so many of those experiences helped inform the way I can come at paradox, like conflicting ideas. Like, how do you hold conflicting ideas and make sense of them? And that's what we've got to equip our students to do. We can't pave the way and make everything safe and comfortable for them, because life is not safe and comfortable. And so being able to show them that they can hold paradoxical or conflicting ideas, retain their own sense of values, ethics, a code, a creed, but still understand from the other side or from alternative sides. There's too little of this, I think, unfortunately. And
I completely agree. I think having students build perspective, see things from different angles, allows for that, building that opportunity to find common ground, to move forward. But also it builds empathy. And I think when we have that foundation of empathy, you're able to get out of your own way, not be so myopic, but instead be inclusive. And I think that's a part of being a global thinker. I think it's so important. It really is.
well, even thinking about listeners for the show today, I'm so curious about how people felt or feel. If they're like, do I want to listen to this episode? Do I press play? Do I not? Does the idea that it's about China or global citizenship feel off-putting? And I would start with that point of like, let's explore that, right? Like, let's try to understand the skepticism that's built for some people when they hear she spent 25 years, in China, and sort of how that positions the way they even react to what I might be saying. I mean, I'm not of Asian heritage or ethnicity. And so what's my right to comment? I think all those questions are worth asking, but how much people get wrong. I mean, the starting point would be China's like pretty capitalist. It's very business oriented. It's very speed and production and work oriented. And so my starting point would be, what have people ever learned about China? Have they mainly learned about its history of communism and its government? And then does that make them think that it's all social welfare oriented, or do they recognize that it's a very vibrant, entrepreneurial, innovative place? And those are like at the macro level. And just on the smaller level, how developed it is. I mean, China's quite far along in terms of its infrastructure. I mean, the rail system, right? The Chinese train system is unbelievably sophisticated and well done. The metro system in Shanghai, when I first moved to Shanghai, there were 2 subway lines. And now there's probably 2 more since I left last July, but maybe 22 lines. And how well they've been constructed, and how clean and how safe and how well lit they are. And again, none of these things are to say that should be surprising, but I don't think that's what comes to mind. And so what I worry about with folks is sort of saying we work so quick to dismiss that we can't say, wait, what could we learn from this? And you know what, I'm not a Vietnam expert. I mean, nothing remotely close at all. I barely know anything, but I did take some classes in school and have some experience. But I've started a few leadership conversations with our internal team, just saying, what are the first three things, for the non-Vietnamese team members, what are the first 3 things that come to mind when I say Vietnam? And what is our role in that narrative, and how do we influence shaping how Vietnam sees its own narrative for the future? And again, I think it's always asking to stop. And I think I would ask the same question. Okay, so when I say China, what are the first three things anybody thinks of hearing this podcast? And then let's check each one of those and try to understand where they originate from.
Yes, exactly. I know when I visited, I was just in awe of how progressive it was. I did not think it would be that progressive. You know, you hear, oh, there's so much smog, there's this, there's that. I didn't experience that, but I came back thinking we need to ramp it up a little bit here in America. You know, sometimes I think we really think that we are the leader in everything. And your point about what can we learn from them is so important. I was so humbled, thinking they're bringing me in as the expert. And once I arrived, I learned immediately, no, I'm not the expert. We're learning from and with each other. And that's the way we need to do it as we move forward, for sure.
You talk about the magic of students being global thinkers. How do you see that? And also, perhaps, how does that tie into living with misconceptions about different parts of the country? How does that all come into play?
I think so much about young people, and when we look back on our youth, and you think about, my goodness, that's what I thought, or that's what I wore, or that's how I approached the world. And you feel one of the real gifts of getting to work with in a school building is I almost feel like you can remember what it felt like to be young more than people who have no connection with that kind of a community. And just, I remember the pain of 10th grade when I was, dealing with social pressures and challenges, and the excitement of being young and going on a really cool field trip and remembering everything about that day. And I think that, I'm constantly trying to think about how to help young people as they get older reflect back on how much their ideas have changed and evolved, and their thinking and their inputs. And again, I think just at the very basic level, one of the things that we've tried to do well in our schools, but I think is very hard in a lot of places, is to teach that ability to reflect, right? Because we can't expect today to know everything. Goodness, if I only knew then. I mean, sure, we have even so many idioms in our language which refer to, right, the past, and just wish what I knew what I know now. But the thing is, you're never going to get that. And so how do you harness within yourself the real skill of reflection so that you can then pull on it when you say, well, gosh, I need to reflect now, and I need to put myself in future situations. And I think for young people, right, who have not, let's say, graduated from high school yet, they've been so influenced by the pandemic in a way that we, of course, didn't experience as young learners. And if we lose that reflection of that, like, that is such an opportunity to hone those skills of reflecting, right? Think about where things were 1 year ago. Think about where things were 2 years ago. How can we take what we learned from that experience and support ourselves and our world into not being in those situations again? And how do we not lose those threads? And again, I think it's the power of reflection, knowing that you don't know everything, and you will know and you will change as you age. That's again just a very powerful thing, because kids are going to make a lot of mistakes, adults make a lot of mistakes, but I think it's our ability to reflect and get us through them that makes us truly globally minded. And so what I mean by that is, many times a day in China, every day, I heard things that I disagreed with. But I really honed my ability to reflect on how those things I was hearing made me feel, and alter my way of approaching difficult ideas or conflicting ideas from an emotional perspective,
right,
versus an intellectual perspective. And just one quick thing on that. So working on a really interesting project with our chancellor, who's in his 80s of the Dwight schools and a real visionary. And he has done some interesting discussions with a Polish neuroscientist who wrote a book that's only available in Polish. And he takes the idea of, his name is Raphael Omi, he takes the idea of, it's not you think, therefore you are, it's you feel, therefore you are. Because he's talking about the emotional aspect of being human. And I think rationalizing that, well, I feel this and I need to know why, I need to hold that and honor that. But then I have my I think piece, and that works. And you need to align those thinking and those emotional responses and understand how to calibrate them. And I think maybe we don't do a great job of that with young people. We push the thinking, or we overly privilege the feeling and we lose the thinking. I mean, just so many different combinations. So I know that's kind of deep and I've been rambling on, but there's a lot of really, really important stuff that still needs to happen with young people to help them with this.
Right. And as you process things, I think the situation you've been in, it has to be very difficult when you don't agree, but yet you stand back. What is it you're telling yourself inside? I'm always interested in that metacognition. What are you saying to yourself that allows you to pull back and not just run with emotion?
But instead, look at that perspective. Yeah.
Right.
So I had this unusual situation in that a lot of the rooms I was in, I was the only really bilingual person.
Oh.
So I've been in a lot of meetings where there could be one or two or three people who only spoke Chinese and some a little bit of English, and one or two or three international folks who spoke maybe many languages but didn't speak Chinese. And so much ran through me translation wise, that I was constantly having the art of translation. I think if done well is not just translating the words, but helping shape how they need to be understood. And so very bilingual people who would often hear my translations would laugh later and say, oh, you kind of workshopped that. And I was thinking, well, I know how this is going to be received if I do a direct translation. Now, I was not a translator, right? I was a person of authority in the institution, so I could sort of help do that. But it also gave way for the thinking time. So meaning when the Chinese party was speaking, the international party was not immediately understanding what was being said. So they are reflecting on the last thing that was said, preparing their thinking. It was this slowed down. Now, by the way, incredibly tedious. I mean, just tedious is all get out. And it was exhausting for me. I mean, I would go home every day, like just totally cross-eyed. But the thing is, it was this bizarre gift of slow down and explanation and rationalization, needing really to say something that could be understood. Because and the reason I raise this is part of the problem when we immediately hear and compute what we're hearing, we're often hearing what we want to hear.
Right.
And we're sort of jumping, how often are you in a conversation where hearing what somebody's saying, but you're really working on your next point?
Right.
And you're really just working to get in there and make your point.
Exactly.
And so there's a lot of books, and I know more and more with the speed of technology, a lot of things about deep listening, mindful listening,
yes,
deep work, taking that time box your schedule, build out thinking time. And I think somehow inherently in that position for 10 years, that was built in for me. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm totally guilty of being the chatterbox. So it was really good for me to not be able to
It's almost a luxury to be able to slow things down and to be able to think through. Yeah. So it's a gift, because just like you said, we're always on the run for the next comment, for the next question, for the next thing to say, instead of really taking in what someone's saying, digesting it, perhaps synthesizing it, letting it marinate a little bit. We don't have the luxury of time often to do that. But it is so important for to gain perspective. and to be inclusive and to, build yourself based on what you're learning from others. Yeah, for
It
sure.
is. And that's that way that, because I needed to translate, I couldn't be like, whoa, what? What did you just say?
Yeah,
Now,
right.
again, maybe emotionally, I was thinking, oh gosh, I got to say this out loud. I got to say this. And there's another gift to being able to say, this may not be my idea, but I think you need to know what's being thought. And then, come back to what do we all really think? Um, the one other thing too is that translation and that slowdown gives the gift of, again, not being able to immediately react, but also knowing that one's own ideas have to go through translation, and so being very, very careful about how you present them, not making assumptions for your listener either, right? It's so one thing is us as listeners not making assumptions, the other thing is not making assumptions for your listener. So I often translated things that I was like, I could never say this in a non-translated situation. I would be way too uncomfortable. But having a caveat, okay, guys, this is a little, all right, we'll have to figure out how we think about this, but this is what this person is thinking. It's so, I mean, even saying it out loud now, I realize like how unbelievably special that is and was.
Yeah. So, finally, what I want to ask is, as you transition from China to Vietnam, we talked about reflection. When you reflect on your experiences in China, what do you think is going to move you forward best as you go on to Vietnam?
Great question. And I mean, I'm thinking this 10 times a day. How do we do that? And what should we change? But the other part of it is the commitment. So I definitely love that startup journey. And so few heads of school get to start schools. And many existing schools would never pick me as their head. I recognize that. I'm sort of in this position because I'm willing to say, I'll do it. And maybe part of me likes to go first because then there's no comparison to somebody else who probably did it better. There's a lot to just saying yes to stuff. And that's the other thing I would tell young people, right? Like just sort of saying, well, let's try. So just an example is when I was first moving to China in 1993, I started coming to Asia. People in New York were like, really? Like, can you drink the water? Can you eat the food? Like, are you going to get sick? I mean, what's the deal? And those are valid questions. But nobody was like, cool. It was all like, whoa. And this Vietnam thing is really interesting because people also maybe think, wow, it's not, how developed is it? And the food's great. And what's that going to be like and stuff. But the kind of idea of not saying going into Vietnam, well, okay, we did this in China, therefore, let me make assumptions about how things would work in another Asian context. And more sort of saying, what do I think we did really well? But even more so saying, okay, I learned this once. I learned what that school community of parents and students and teachers needed once. So I can go in and learn again, as opposed to saying, wow, we did all this awesome stuff in Shanghai that I just know will work somewhere else, because I'm not sure it will. And so I think, again, just it's more about the confidence of saying, okay, I've done this in one context before. Let me go challenge myself to do it in another context. But also, sure, of course, constantly thinking about, well, this stressed me out before in China. How can I preemptively mitigate that challenge? Or, I think case studies are really, really valuable. So like, I think just facing challenges and knowing that you can work through them, and this, just that confidence build. And again, just coming back to students, right? How important that is for them. And we point to growth mindset versus fixed mindset all the time in classroom. And I'm a believer in that, right? And it doesn't mean you don't fear failure, but it's about, for me, the startup gift is trying to get comfortable with worst case scenario accepting and understanding what that is and continuing to move forward. So what I always say to my students is I just try to say yes to things, and I don't try not to overthink them too much in the beginning. Say yes, get comfortable with worst case, and keep moving, because I do think a lot of teenagers, my daughter in particular, loves to say no to everything. I think that's just age, but I think in the classroom, trying to say yes and trying to be open is something that's important. And so for me, that's what the whole next move is about. It's about just saying yes to something that came my way and seizing the opportunity, and just, knowing that I can get through it. And maybe we're losing some of that sort of bravery or challenge. I like to think of it as being daring as opposed to being torn down by things.
Definitely an element of being a global thinker, for sure.
I have a technical question to ask you. As you're starting a new school, are there teacher shortages as there are in the United States? And what is it you look for in a teacher that's going to teach in a global situation?
So absolutely great question. And actually what I've been saying to a lot of people who are so worried about the situation with people leaving the profession is, listen, if you're a teacher somewhere in the US who's feeling really like you can't do it anymore and you need a change, maybe rather than leaving the profession, think about taking a tour outside the US as a teacher. You could be in a different context like China or anywhere really where you would find yourself contributing in a new way, being valued in a new way. And I just think it can be so uplifting, and not to say that you've got to move abroad or stay abroad. I know people have a lot of personal constraints, but 2 years, these international schools offer tuition for your children if you have them. And, often will have roles for spouses if they're needed. And so again, just again, this is like looking at our profession of being an educator in the United States and putting a different angle on it. And maybe that's an international angle that you never thought of before. And there's a lot of great resources. If you start searching online, you'll find tons of different search firms that are focused on this as a specific target area. And so I would say that's one thing I would offer as an antidote to some of the sentiment maybe you have in your current situation. The other part of it would be, so yes, internationally, absolutely, there's a competition for great teachers and educators, but there are people from all over the world who do want to have an international experience. And so what I would just say for me, it's really identifying who makes sense in that international setting. And so when I think about moving teachers to Vietnam, it's going to be really hard to do Hanoi if you've never left your home state before. And so I would say I look for teachers who are scaffolding that experience of maybe they've gone abroad and it was potentially to a more developed place or an English speaking country. And then they say, yeah, that worked for me, that worked for my family. And so we're going to take another step. And I think that's very important because it's extremely hard to be somebody's first post outside of the US, and particularly hard in a place like Vietnam, I think. And it was in China as well to be first post. I look for that. And the other thing too is that I think sometimes you can find alternative pathways. So folks who have maybe not only worked in teaching, but they've worn different hats, they've had different types of jobs, or they maybe have been involved in some sort of entrepreneurial activity themselves. So I'm also looking for that. What is going to help this person be successful in a startup? Because startups are painful no matter what industry, and they're hard and they require a lot of sacrifice. And I need, my just a kind of cool metaphor. So at a meeting the other day, our chancellor was talking about something that his father used to say, which is that his father used to say, people start out as squares and life takes the edges off. And then you start to roll and you roll and roll and you're more like a wheel. And I really love that because I think I'm looking for people who have had their edges taken off in different ways and like looking how to put them in a community. And so just a simple resume vet is not doing the service to our community that we need to do to build the community, not just a collection of individuals who all like meet the JD or whatever.
Yes, exactly. So they really need to be people that can work with others and interconnected and part of a team, and not a solo person that likes to work on their own. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's what we're all looking for. I bet we look for the same characteristics in teachers here as you do in Vietnam.
I think for sure there's and look, of course, it's wonderful if your faculty feel like teaching is a calling for them, right? And it goes beyond, but also practically, people need income and support for their families and health insurance, and they need to be able to live. And I think that's our other, that is that's something that's a little bit out of our control in a lot of ways, right? How teachers are valued from a monetary perspective. And that's something that I also try to look at really closely and think about building equity and opportunity and making sure you both have this experience. Who are the folks who've been in your office who have asked for more or who have negotiated versus who are the people who haven't? And how are we making sure we represent the voices of those who won't ever advocate for themselves?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yes. That's a good point. Well, Brantley, as we kind of wrap up the show today, there's a question we love to ask people. And that would be, in your 25 years abroad and teaching in another country, what has become clear to you?
What's become clear to me is that the world is not a zero-sum game. So there aren't clear winners and clear losers. There are a series of interconnected values that we must hold dear, no matter what our national borders are. And it's, as international educators, our absolute responsibility to educate young people to view that interconnectedness as a fundamental part of their mission going forward as members of the world. And I think that what the gift of being outside of my own culture and context gave me was an ability to look at my own culture and myself and gain the self-awareness to say, do I like what I see? Do I agree with what I see? And am I going to choose to be an active member of really, really trying to make the world a better place? And it's lofty and it's idealistic, but it is, to me, the mission of international education, that we fundamentally need to make the world better for everyone. And if I can be a small part of that or encourage my students and my colleagues to be contributing to that mission, then I feel really positive and optimistic about the future.
Yes. Oh, that's great. That's a great quote to end on, actually.
Perfect.
We thank you so much. How long will you be in the United States before you head over to your new job?
So officially move in August. I will be out of the country in June on the wrapping up some stuff in China and a little bit of a summer break, I hope.
Good.
But otherwise, it's been so great being in the US as well. There's so many things to celebrate about America, and it's been fun to reconnect with all of that this year.
Oh, that's great. Well, we hope to follow up with you and hear how it's going in Vietnam and get an update from you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And please do send people my way. If you run across folks looking for a new experience,
Yes.
We will be about a year from now, we'll be opening. So we will start hiring this fall. And I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to find me. And if anybody wants to reach out, that's a great way to connect, is Brantley Turner on LinkedIn.
All right.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to meet you and hear about your experiences.
Yes, my pleasure as well.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.